So in addition to being an academic, I also run an organization called Farm Forward. So I'm which is primarily about fighting factory farming. Just to, in advance, address the question just came up. I myself am a vegan, and if it was Aaron's personal world I was creating, that's what it would be. But as an advocate, I'm really focused on ending industrial farming. And so one of the things that makes me think this kind of gathering is so important is because I think religious institutions have a very important role to play in them. What I've observed in the animal movement so far is an extremely poor use of this resource. So, for example, I do some work with the Humane Society of the United States on religion outreach. They do a lot of phenomenal stuff. But basically, the vision is, Aaron, can you help me get this or that rabbi or this or that famous religious person to sign up for this proposition that we're working on in California or in Colorado? It's a very worthwhile thing to do. I mean, I'm spending my own time doing it, but it's also so limited. Graham Harvey, when I kind of posed a question along these lines to him, I thought gave one of the answers that excites me, which is it could be that these traditions actually might have a better way of approaching this issue than animal advocates themselves. They may have tools for raising consciousness and motivating people that we don't have in the animal welfare movement without that alliance. Let me give an example, or say two things about what I think this would mean. One is it would mean if we turn to religious communities as animal advocates, but with more of an eye towards conversation and engagement, we're going to end up with a diversity of voices, tremendous diversity of voices. And I don't mean between the traditions. I mean within the tradition. You know, there's going to be folks ready to end factory farming. There's going to be folks ready to go vegan. There's going to be folks everywhere in between. There's going to be some opposition. And if we pretend that the only legitimate religious voice is the one that agrees with us, we're going to look insincere in our engagement with them. So one of the things I think that would mean is kind of tolerance for views that we disagree with as part of a conversation in order to uplift those religious views which we might. There seems to be this notion I encounter among activists that they want to hear only the good bits from the religious traditions. I think talking about both is going to be very helpful. And let me give you, so it's not totally abstract, a real-life example of where I think religious traditions might be far more radical than the vegan advocates that I often work with. So we have a suffering reduction model by and large in the animal movement. Even people who are abolitionists have a kind of incremental attack approach of various kinds. And one of the things that is not on the radar anywhere there is the actual lifespan of animals. So if a hen is alive 40 days, the animal movement is focused on its life during those 40 days. If it's alive 60 days, it's interested in those 60 days. But it never asks, how much does an animal have to live before it had a life worth living? You know, if we're working in the traditional framework that it's okay to eat meat if there's some kind of fair deal, you know, what constitutes the fair deal here? Now, I had never thought of this issue myself, being enculturated coming out of the animal rights movement. Where I was hearing this from was farmers who were really upset with folks who were supporting essentially better factory farms, and these are folks doing non-factory farms. And when you look at these issues in terms of the welfare of birds we raise for meat, what you're going to see very quickly is that there is nobody advocating for animals to have what was their normal lifespan up until 50 years ago, 110 days. Often the best things that are being advocated by the groups I really admire are still birds who have had their genetics sped up so that they go to market in 84 days instead of the 40-some days. And I've approached animal groups and I said, might an extra day of life, additional days of life, maybe in particular in which certain things happen where they form relationships and do the things that birds do, might this be something worth considering? Might we have an argument for saying we prefer the animal, now that we've established it having a good life and it's not in misery, we prefer that animal to be on the earth a certain amount of time because that's valuable, its life being able to be lived in a good way. This is something which religion has a vocabulary to discuss immediately, and which kind of flummoxes the animal rights movement. Not because people ultimately aren't concerned with this issue, but because we don't have a vocabulary that allows us to discuss it. So the remarks I'm going to turn to on Judaism, and this will be a descriptive attempt to actually describe for you in a religious studies mode, rather than speak to you, which I'll probably take a side to do as a Jewish person who's kind of advocating. I'm going to try to give you a picture of the Jewish tradition, but the way in which I have structured this academic presentation is with a view towards it having value for folks who want to do work with the Jewish community on these issues, and for people in the Jewish community who are trying to do work on these issues. So I'm going to hop around the handout if you want to follow me. You certainly don't need to make sense of this, but it's there to enrich it. The first thing I want to highlight is the first bullet on the page. This is an undeniable feature of the Abrahamic traditions, including Judaism, that we often, I think, miss the significance of. The dominant metaphor for the relationship between God and his people in the Hebrew Bible is that of the shepherd. Now think about what this means historically. This means when people looked around and said, what is the relationship that God has with me? The thing that most resembled it for them was the ideal of a good shepherd. Now, I can tell you nobody would come up with that today. Right? Nobody would come up with that today. This is something very significant, and we often don't realize how deeply it's there in the tradition. These traditions have been thinking about the human-animal relationship and the question of eating animals and using animals from the very beginning. So I would argue, if we had more time, and you see some details there, that the Hebrew Bible has a number of resources in this direction. But if we just have a Hebrew Bible text, we really don't have Judaism. There's sometimes a confusion that the Old Testament, what I'm calling the Hebrew Bible, represents Judaism. It doesn't, any more than the Old Testament without the New Testament represents Christianity. The Hebrew Bible, or what you could call the Tanakh, read through the lens of rabbinic writings. And by the way, the main rabbinic writing, the Mishnah, about the same size as the New Testament, written in the same period as the New Testament. It's reading the Hebrew Bible through that lens that makes it a Jewish perspective. So what will be interesting to me as I go through is, what did the rabbis do with these laws in the Hebrew Bible, and how did they develop them? I'm going to share a single story for you, which definitely is one of the strongest stories in the text, but it's in a very central place. So within the Talmud, there's a whole slew of rabbis. We have all sorts of different rabbi hero figures. We don't have a kind of like Moses figure like we do in the Hebrew Bible. There's just a bunch of stars. But even though that's the case, there is one rabbi, and only one rabbi, who is simply referred to as the rabbi. And it's his full name, Judah Hanasi. But otherwise, it's just the rabbi. And he's arguably the one who redacted, essentially, the Jewish equivalent of the New Testament. So he's a very eminent person within the world of the Talmud. And he's sitting at the gate of town, watching folks go by, doing their things. And he sees a calf being read. The text says, l'shechita, to a legitimate slaughter within this context. But the calf breaks away, runs over to Judah Hanasi, buries his head in his cloak, and weeps. What does Judah Hanasi do? Quotes scripture at the animal and says, go, this is for what you were made. But what happens next? The heavenly court looks down upon him and says, because you did not have compassion upon creatures, we will bring suffering upon you. And then the story kind of stops there for a while, and there's a bunch of other stuff, and talks of his suffering, which the rabbis figure went on for 13 years. And then later in the text, the story is concluded. One day he's in his home. We've switched from the square to the home. And he's speaking to his servant, his female servant. And she's about to sweep up, we don't know exactly what the animals are, some kind of small rodent. And I'm going to go into detail here for a moment. You'll see why it's significant. Now, sweeping a rodent, like rodents are going to run away. You know, how are they sweeping the rodents? Because the sweeping verb is very clear, even though the noun is not. What I think must be pictured here is, if anyone's ever come across a nest of mice or rats before they got all their faculties and they're blind and helpless and can hardly move, I think that's what's being swept up here. And I think it's very significant for the story that these are creatures utterly dependent upon their mother and care. And what happens at this moment is Judah Hanasi stops the servant from doing that and quotes Psalms, God's mercy are upon all God's works. And the heavenly court looks down and says, because you had compassion, we will relieve your suffering. I think it's a story that also captures the sense that though this is a very high value as far as heaven is concerned, even very great rabbis struggle with this question. Now, the next thing I want to do is try to give you what I'm going to call the horizons of Jewish animal ethics. That is, what's a minimal threshold and where does it kind of break down. The minimal threshold is that it's just obviously a concern. You know, it's very clear that you have to be thinking about how animals are treated. It's woven into the law in hundreds and hundreds of ways. We can say very definitively that legally enshrining protection for animals is a minimal standard where the Jewish tradition begins. And it tends to use language like Professor Clough talked about, if you harm an animal, it has to be for a legitimate human need. And here's the part where it gets frustrating for many of us. The paradigmatic example of human need is desire to eat flesh. And in this world, it's very clear. They don't believe you need to eat flesh. They just think there's a very strong desire for it. And meeting that desire counts as a legitimate need. Now, if you challenge that premise, as a minority stream in Judaism does, you are essentially challenging what is the mainstream Jewish view of animal protection. So I would say the mainstream view goes all the way up to the point at which we might say we shouldn't be eating animals, and it won't cross that line. When you cross that line, you end up in the world of a minority stream, very powerful stream. Joyce quoted Isaac Bashevis Singer, right? Did I see? Yeah, great Jewish Yiddish writer, won the Nobel Prize, and he is probably the best representative of this radical tradition. If you've heard of him at all, you would think of him as a completely contemporary figure. But I can trace the kind of views that he had basically as far as I can get, and then the text starts to disappear. He takes a very strong stance, as you saw. I'm a vegetarian for the health of the chickens. You know, so that view is there, but definitely, again, working in a descriptive mode here, outside of the mainstream. The second thing I want to give you a picture of is the crude kind of form of Jewish ethics. How does Jewish ethics work around animals, and to some extent in general? You certainly have rulings on this or that, where you can say, okay, this particular activity is prohibited. So, for example, hunting is something there's been very strong, hunting for sport, I should emphasize, has very strong rabbinic condemnation all through the medieval period up into the present. But in general, that's not the kind of driver. What's the driver is these tensions within the tradition. The way in which Judaism tends to do ethics is to say one thing and to contradict it and to put it in your face and say deal with it. And something comes out. So to give you the most dramatic example of this, we have the verse in Genesis, the best real estate in the entire Hebrew scriptures, right in the first chapter, giving us this notion of dominion, which you've all heard about, but then immediately after that, commanding this kind of vegetarian veganism. Now, I want to suggest that's not accidental. This wasn't like a slip, putting two things together that seem tense. On the one hand, I'm giving you animals. On the other hand, you can't eat them, right? And then when the text does give permission to eat animals, which is after the flood and corruption, it doesn't really look like it's being done with great love. But after that happens, there's still another restriction, but you can't have the animal's lifeblood. You can't have the animal's life. And again, you have a principle which seems to be pointing towards the ability to use, and a principle drawing limits. And then you are put with that and left to deal with it. Remind me when I have till? 10 minutes. Yeah, great. So what I recently spent a lot of time doing was essentially compiling all of the Jewish texts which are regularly cited in favor of animal welfare or opposed to it, basically just dealing with it one way or another. And I attempted to do a taxonomy of them. This is something I'm trained to do as a religious studies scholar. That is, to look in this mass of what first looks like chaos, do we see real clear patterns where there's particular kinds of themes reemerging, which is the case, and which allows me to summarize a really significant amount of literature pretty quickly. If you're following in the handout, this is going to be the top of page 2. So as I started, the opening horizon of Jewish animal ethics is animals matter. That's often an argument we have to fight in other spheres, not here. So the first reason I'm going to discuss is one should be compassionate to animals for the sake of humanity in some kind of way. Now, when I went deep on this, it didn't irritate me the way I thought it would. The other reason, which you can guess, is for the sake of the animals. So I will get to that reason in just a moment. I saw 3 major bodies of ideas that seem to support this notion that caring for animals is an important virtue, even if you're strictly concerned with humans. One is that you consistently have it rewarded, as in the story I told you. When Judah Hanasi is compassionate, he receives reward. That is not just one story. We have lots of stories like this. Another thing we see repeated again and again is that people of great moral stature spontaneously are kind to animals. So Moses, for example, is held up in a number of stories as the ideal shepherd in engaging in acts that we would all describe as acts of compassion. And finally, as one might expect, there is the simple logical argument that if you are insensitive to animals, that is likely to come over into the human realm. Here's where I think it gets a little bit more interesting. My best read of the broad kind of understanding of what the rabbis are doing is they have a strong sense of what I think we would call empathy as a human capacity. Think of it as a capacity we need to have in order to do ethics. I have to minimally be able to kind of guess a little bit what that other being is feeling and care about that in some kind of way before I can respond and act on it. And the rabbis think that this mechanism, empathy, doesn't really distinguish between people and other animals. True empathy is just empathy. If you have a problem with empathy, you're likely to have it with both animals and people. They seem to view it that way. And so it's for this reason that being cruel to animals seems to be dangerous from their point of view in terms of inculcating human compassion. So really, it comes out of a sense of a deep similarity, that we are kind of bound together in vulnerability and in need of compassion. So the second reason, which I think this crowd will appreciate more, is that they have inherent value. Animals matter in and of themselves. And again, that is expressed in a number of sub-themes. God cares for animals, so all sorts of incidents in which God intervenes that do not help humans, but spending his time helping animals. We have, especially in the Psalms, the notion that animals praise God by their very existence. Right? That's a reason to keep an animal alive longer, by the way. So it can finish its song, if you will, in praise of God. And finally, the last category is probably the weakest in terms of coherence, but that animals are imbued with the divine and reflect the divine. This is, in many cases, connected with the notion of the image of God being within every human being. You have a number of very authoritative Jewish thinkers who seem to want to take that notion that the image of God is in human beings and say, no, the image of God is in creation. It's in human beings, but not only human beings. And this is not, again, radical new thinking. This is stuff you can see embedded. So that notion that when I harm a human being, I am harming God, which has been expressed very powerfully in a lot of Jewish human rights kind of rhetoric, that notion is there also in relation to animal. If I'm indifferent to an animal suffering, it is as if I'm indifferent to God's suffering. A very powerful set of reasons. So in terms of argument, in terms of logical reasons for ourselves, for the animals, with those kinds of subtypes, what that leads us with in terms of responsibility, and then I'm going to pause and see where I'm at, is 2 main obligations to animals. So what does it mean when we say you have to be kind to animals? Well, one reason is to protect this precious and imperiled human compassion. That sense of empathy really matters in the world. The world really needs it. If a child harms an animal, you're destroying that compassion. If the child is encouraged in compassion, you're expanding it. This is a very strong reason. And it corresponds with, of course, all of those reasons I gave, which are linked with caring for animals for the sake of humanity. The second one really deals with the inherent value of animals, and I find this very interesting. It's not just saying, oh, go help animals here and there, or if you see a wild animal sick, try to help it. That might be included, but that's not really the focus. The focus of the text is on protecting animals where economic situations make exploitation likely. That's what we are to do. So the paradigmatic example that's used in the Talmud is a donkey cart that's overloaded and how you are supposed to respond to that. In other words, what the text is warning us is if we want to help animals, we should be attentive to where there is a financial gain in harming animals, and we should focus on that area because that is likely there's going to be abuse here. In other words, there's kind of a presumption that there will be abuse where there is economic gain and that it's necessary to come in with regulation.